You may be seated. It's a study sheet day. I had Brian print 30, so I think we're probably a couple short. So if you're sitting next to somebody you with, especially more towards. And keep your Siddur out because we're going to need the Siddur. But first, for those of you that were here last week, I have an answer to the question. I actually feel like, of course, I should have known this. But the question was, where did the phrase coat of many colors come from? We looked at the Torah, we looked at the book of Genesis, we saw that it was called pasim, which could mean, nice or fancy or maybe striped, but nowhere in the Torah does it say coat of many colors. So that translation of coat of many colors, of course, appears in the King James Bible, which is just example of a gazillion examples of how Christian culture has permeated our very thinking. I did a double check. It also actually first appears in the Septuagint, which is the earliest translation of the Torah translated into Greek. So it's possible that the King James Bible got it from the Septuagint, though if you read about the translation of the King James Bible, it claims that it used the Torah for the Torah part. So I don't know, but it appears in both places. So that's how we get coat of many colors. That's part of our English experience. So now we're going to switch to Hanukkah. For any of you that saw the WTTW Hanukkah special, which I have to say I was really pleased with, they were very nice to give me one of the funnier lines, which was the question about the story of the oil, and did the rabbis just make it up? And I said yes. And some people were surprised because you'd never heard that before, and I'm sorry, I know there are younger people here, and I don't want to. There is no Santa Claus. All right. Everybody has to have their myth breakers. So.
Jeffrey said all three rabbis said it.
Yeah, he said all three rabbis said it, but I was the funniest. Which was better than saying I was the oldest, which is also true. Okay, so I want to look at what is the background to all this? In what way do we understand to say that the rabbis made it up? Where does that idea even come from? And the only way that we can really understand where that idea might have, we don't really know, why it came so late in the story and why we have other sources that don't talk about the oil. The only way we can sort of see this is look at all of these many, many sources, which is why I brought a study sheet, because it's just really too much to read without you seeing it. But we're going to look back at the earliest source of the story of the Maccabees, and that is the book of the Maccabees. So the Hasmonean revolt against the Assyrian Greeks started in about 167 of the Kamin era. I've been seeing this a lot on Facebook this season about when we tell the story of Hanukkah, when our non-Jewish friends wish us a happy Hanukkah, that the story about Hanukkah is so old, and it's about the redemption of the land of Israel. So let's, just an important thing to remember in our story. So the book of Maccabees, the book of Maccabees was written about 100 BCE, so not that long after the revolt was finally over. The revolt lasted longer than we tell in our little story. And they believe that it was originally written in Hebrew, but there is no Hebrew transcript that exists. The only transcripts, the earliest transcripts we have are in Greek, which is, maybe ironic, but that's the way it goes. So let's look at the English translation. And of course, when we're reading this, think to yourselves, what is missing from the story? The earliest source that we have that tells us the story of the victory. So then Judah appointed certain men. I'd actually say there's kind of two things that don't really appear here, though one does a teeny bit. Then Judah appointed certain men to fight against those who were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose pure priests who had not abandoned the covenant of their Lord, and he commanded them to cleanse the sanctuary and carry out the defiled stones into an unclean place. Remember, the story goes that the Assyrian Greeks used our temple for idol worship, so they had defiled it, so it needed to be cleaned before we could use it again. And they saw the altar of burnt offerings was profaned, and they consulted as what should be done with it. They thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them because the heathens had defiled it. So they pulled down the altar, and then they built a new altar. They laid up the stones of the altar on the mountain of the temple in a convenient place until there should come a prophet to show what should be done with them. So we don't know what to do with the defiled altar, so we'll just put it outside in the storage room until somebody can come and tell us what to do with these stones. Are they so violated that they can never be used again? Maybe not, so we have them, we keep them just in case we might be able to reuse them, but in the meantime, they build a new altar. They took whole stones which had never been hewn with iron according to the law and built a new altar according to the former. They made up the sanctuary and the things that were within the temple and hallowed the courts. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the candelabrum and the altar of incense and the temple of showbread. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlestick they lighted, that they may give light to the temple. And furthermore, they set the loaves of the showbread upon the table, and spread out the veils of the ark, and finished all the works which they had begun to make. Now, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifices according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings. They dedicated the altar on the same day the heathens profaned it, and they praised God with songs, violins, harps, and cymbals. And there was great gladness among the people, because God had rolled away the disgrace of the heathens from upon them. And Judah and his brothers and the whole congregation of Israel ordained to celebrate the dedication of the altar on the 25th day of the month of Kislev for 8 days, from year to year, with praise and thanks to God. Yes. We need the mic.
Did you just tell us that this was written by Greeks? Or
No,
in Greek?
it was written in Greek, but the assumption is it was written by Jews.
So then thank you, and when it says in the 148th year,
That means before the Common Era.
what would
I'm
they
not
come to?
sure how they came up, right? Just let's not go with
Okay,
that.
sorry.
We know it's before the Common Era. If they were counting Hebrew date, it would be a different date. So
Maybe it was from somebody's rule.
they believe that the original is in Hebrew, but there is no manuscript that exists in Hebrew. They never found it. They don't have it. So the assumption is this was translated originally from Hebrew into Greek. So what's not here? Oh.
I
Right.
just wanted to make a different comment, because this was something new I learned just last year, which I can't believe I never learned this before. It was not in the documentary either, but I read somewhere that the reason they did 8 days was to make up for not
All right,
celebrating.
we're going to get there.
Oh,
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. But what's not in the story? Oil, the miracle of the oil. I would say the other thing that's kind of not in the story is God. God's a little bit in the story at the end, right? God rolled away our disgrace. But this is the story of the end of a military victory that brought the Hasmoneans, the Jews, the Israelites, back into power after they get rid of this other army, which was not a small feat. And they rededicate the temple, and they light the lights. Right? It's not only that there's no story of the burning of the oil. What's the most important feature of the temple that they're rebuilding in this story? The altar, right? If you're going to say, what was the most important thing in this story? The most important thing is the story of the altar. The lights were lit to, if you're going to, open a new building, you have to light the lights, right? That's kind of an aside. The focus here is the altar. So this is our earliest source that tells the story, and it's a story of rededication after this military victory. God is given some credit here, but mostly the credit goes to Judah and his family. So now we're going to look at Book of Maccabees 2, which there's a Book of Maccabees 1, there's a Book of Maccabees 2. They tell the story, they tell it slightly differently. The Maccabees, of course, is not in the Bible, right? This is a post-biblical source, which is probably why many of you have never actually even seen any of this before. And most of the story of Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2 is the military, the very bloody military victory. That's most of what it recounts. Now, Judah Maccabee and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple in the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary, made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices after a lapse of 2 years, right? So, again, the big focus here is the sacrifices. They offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence, right? So again, the lamps were lit because how else would you conduct? You were not going to conduct things in the dark. When they finished all of these things, they fell on their faces and beseeched God, saying, "Please, God, you guarded us to victory from this trouble that was with us, and if we have sinned before you, rebuke us according to your kindness, and do not give us over any further into the hands of foreigners who disgraced your holy name." It happened that on that same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals, and they decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year, right? So the idea that what the celebration of Hanukkah was to take the place of the celebration of Sukkot, because they couldn't celebrate Sukkot because the temple was not in their hands. So when Donna says, I never knew that, a lot of people never knew that, but it's a very ancient source that tells us that Hanukkah was the replacement for Sukkot. But again, this is a little more, God's a little bit more, praying's a little, what's the whole point of the service? The point of the service is to atone for your sins, so this one adds a little bit of prayer. Okay. But what's not in here again? The oil and the miracle of the oil. So I asked you to take out your Siddur, so let's look at a much later source by a couple hundred years. Like Al Hanisim, which we sing, and then the addition to Al Hanisim. They think Al Hanisim, which we sing on Hanukkah, which is on page 430, is almost as old as the book of the Maccabees. Not quite as old, but I don't know the whole other description that comes after in the days of Matidyahu, son of Yochanan. I'm not sure that that's as old, but let's look at Al Hanisim. It's inserted into the Amidah. It's become a popular Hanukkah song. This is also part of Birkat Hamazon, and this source could be as early as 100 BCE. So not quite as early as the Maccabees, just a little bit later, but almost simultaneous. So the rabbis decree that this is what has to be added into the Amidah for Hanukkah. For the miracles, for the deliverance, for the victories, for the triumphs, and for the battles you fought for our ancestors in those days and at this time. So what are we thanking God? Now, this way inserts God into the story, right? If God was a little bit in the story of the Maccabees, now who gets all the credit here? God gets all the credit, right? Like, it's God that did this. It's God, so God comes back into the story, or is introduced into the story. But what are we thanking God for? The military victory, the deliverance, and yes, Donna?
And I'm just thinking that could be 100, 200 years from now, we're all saying thank you to Tzahal.
Yes.
People might say thank you to God.
That's right. Look, many people in 67, however things turned out with the West Bank, not as we had hoped, but in 67, when the Israeli army retook the Kotel, There were many that said it was a military victory, and this is a lovely historical thing, and there are many that felt like this is a miracle, right? The kotel restored to our hands. Kind of depends on how you interpret miracles. Like, there's a very popular Hanukkah song in Israel, Mi Yamalel, if anybody knows it, Mi Yamalel Gvurot Israel, Otam Yimna B'chol Dor Vador Yakum Hagibor Go El Ha'am, right? In every generation, there is a hero that restores the people. This song was an early kibbutz favorite, no God, right? Who did this? Who restored the land of Israel? The soldiers, the heroes, that's who did it. So especially in modern times, this plays out of how we interpret it, but the rabbis, being the rabbis, wanted to give all glory to God. But what are they celebrating? Not the oil, right? Not the oil, but the military victory. And we're not going to read this whole long paragraph, but you can. But in the center, as much as, the question of, well, the question today may feel a little bit different than the question a year ago. How powerful is Israel, right? Pretty darn powerful. Pretty strong army, can do a lot, and probably could do even more that we've yet to see. But that's not really the story that we tell ourselves, or that we believe about ourselves, or that Israel believes about themselves. But you delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the evildoers into the hands of the righteousness, the arrogant into the hands of those engaged with your Torah. Right? If you want to know sort of the core psychological story of the Jewish people and any victory that we've ever had, that's the story, right? I mean, now maybe October 7th has turned that a little bit on its head. But at one point early on, Israel and certainly the United States was very concerned that this war was going to become an entire regional war. And if it had become an entire regional war, Israel still would have been, with all of its power, a pretty small piece in that bigger regional war. So there's always that sort of psychological thing. Okay, now let's go back to our study sheets. And we're going to look at Pesikta Rabbati. Pesikta Rabbati is a midrash. It was written in the land of Israel, and it's about the same time as the piece of Talmud we're going to look at in a moment. But this is the story that's still being told in the land of Israel in about, 400, 500 of the Kamin era, so 500 years after the actual Maccabee story. A song of the dedication of the house of David. Why do we light Hanukkah lamps? At that time, the sons of the Hasmonean, the great priest, triumphed over the kingdom of Greece. When they entered the temple, they found their 8 iron stakes and fixed them in the ground and lit lamps on them. So again, there just happened to be these stakes lying around, or maybe they were in the ground. 8, a perfect number. Let's light them. That's the story. But they were spears, which also could be, spears into plowshares, spears, military defeat, whatever, okay? But now, finally, at long last, we're going to get to the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, their scholars debate exactly when this was written, but about 400, 500 of the Common Era. Some people think it might even be a tad later or a tad earlier, but we're just going to give that as a working number. And it's written in Babylonia. And now, at long last, 600 years-ish after the victory of the Maccabees, we get the following story. The Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah? So just like Pesikta Rabbati, they ask the question, but they're going to have a different answer. What is Hanukkah, and why are lights kindled on Hanukkah? The Gemara answers, the sages taught in another place in the Torah, in another place in the Talmud, on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched, and they found only 1 cruse of oil that was placed within the seat of the high priest, undisturbed by the Greeks. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum for only 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabrum from it 8 days. right? So this is a super old source, right? Like, this is not a source that was written yesterday, but it's written hundreds of years after all these other sources that don't mention the oil. The Talmud introduces the story of the oil. Why? They don't leave us footnotes, right? We really don't know. Now, is it possible that this was a common folk tale that people were telling and that it wasn't just made up out of like, we've never thought about this before, but let's write, I mean, it's possible, right? All kinds of stories could rise up around a holiday that you're celebrating. But this is the first time we see it.
Well, going back to your original question, which is what's missing?
What's missing? Right, thank you. And what's missing? The military victory, right? They're playing up the miracle, which means, first of all, let's talk about who is the ultimate victor here. If it's a miracle, it's God. Like, when you see how long it took them to build this altar, they could have built an oil-producing factory in the same amount of time, right? So there's no military victory here, though they leave the military victory in the Amidah, right? It's not gone. They don't erase it from all of our sources. It's in the Amidah. It's in the Birkat Hamazon. We read it every day of Hanukkah multiple times. So they leave it, but there is this extra addition that makes it into this miracle of the oil. So there are many reasons that people, okay, Deanna, go ahead.
Okay, so I once learned that in today's world, we have in our country, we have Republicans and Democrats. They have these big battles, we'll call them, and at the end of the battle, you have an election, you have a winner, and then traditionally, everyone makes nice, and they have to take each other's and to make the world happen. Let's just stick with that story for a minute. I know things have changed. But at this time, you had also two groups. You had the religious, and you had the military. And you had the military won, and so after the military is the ones who won, somehow they had to make nice with the religious.
So let's just, yes, but, okay? The religious were the military. There was something going on at this time that we don't like to talk about, which is we would not really like Judah Maccabee and his family. Right? They were religious zealots, and they were not only fighting against the Assyrian Greeks, they were fighting against Hellenized Jews. So there was also a bit of a civil war going on at the same time. There's actually a really nice New York Times piece that was published this past week by Abigail Pergriben and Rabbi Dov Linzer about that, right? The rabbis choose not to tell that story. They choose not to tell the story about infighting. You wouldn't even know that there was infighting between Jewish people here. So they don't talk about the infighting. They tell a story that's like sort of for all of us. They don't condemn zealotry, which they certainly could have because they didn't really like it. They thought it could lead to very bad places. They don't tell that story, nor do they condemn Hellenized Jews. And they choose not to tell that story, which is a very interesting thing to ponder. They don't, they want to leave us a story that sort of the Jewish people are intact, is a little bit more unified. By the way, they hated the Hasmoneans. This was also could be a power struggle between the rabbis and the Hasmoneans, right? So the rabbis really don't like them. So this could be also just their way of, a power grab. These people are gone. We don't like them. We don't like what they did. We don't like what they became. We're the true leaders now moving forward. We don't like, we want a meritocracy, whatever. So it could also be a political battle that the victors write the story. The other reason that's often given is that during rabbinic times, there were multiple revolts against Rome. By the time the rabbis are writing some of this, they are no longer an autonomous Jewish, government. They're being ruled by Rome. And there have been multiple attempts at revolting against Rome, which ended in disaster. And so the other story the rabbis are telling is there is no military path here. Stop thinking about that. Stop glorifying that because it's suicide. And that sort of idea, and mostly because Jews were helpless, held for 2,000 years. The only way we were going to get the land of Israel back was how? God, right? When God was ready to step in and give the land back to us, we would have the land of Israel. And many ultra-Orthodox are anti-Zionist, anti the Israeli government, anti the idea of a modern Zionist state, because they feel it's a violation of Jewish law, and it's only God that can give us back the state. That's why they don't recognize the modern state of Israel or the government, though it never stops them from taking a lot of money and voting in the elections. But nonetheless, and who were the first group of people that said, yeah, no, let's just wait a minute? Secular Zionists, who said, we're not waiting anymore. We've waited for thousands of years. The time is now. We need to take action, and we need to reclaim our state. And so the story of Israel, you can imagine how this story resonates in Israel. And by the way, well, everybody lights Chanukiah, and they certainly talk about the miracle. But in Israel, the story is really the military victory. The state of Israel is the first autonomous Jewish government since the Maccabees. They see themselves as the heirs to that. I mean, they ignore some of the excesses, of course, of the Hasmoneans. But this story, and the few against the many, if you think about 1948 or 67 or 73, like the story of that, their story is our story. And that it feels like, and I think this is, what I really is very hard, because I think, part of it is your age, part of it is what you've lived through as an adult and what you remember. They talk a lot about that young people who didn't live through 67 and 73 and that they look at Israel's powerful, and it's always been powerful. Like, they don't really, as some of us maybe do, understand that with all of the military victory and with all of the power and with all of that, it still feels like a miracle, right? It still feels like a miracle that we even have a state. And, it's hard to, I think because we're all of a, not everybody here is of the same generation. There are kids here today. But for many of us that are within a certain time frame, that seems fairly obvious, whatever that word miracle actually might mean. Anyways, I know this was long, but there was a lot to cover. Does anybody else have any, David, thank you. But we have to give you the mic because we have people on live stream.
So just a question to asking somewhat rhetorically is, if Hanukkah is 8 days because it's a Sukkot Sheni, but all the holidays were missed. Why isn't it 7 days? Why isn't it Pesach Sheni? Why isn't it Shavuos Sheni? What is it about Sukkot?
Okay.
And the reason is, people know Sukkot was the time of the dedication of the temple. So it's at Sukkot that Solomon's temple was dedicated. It's the Haftorah we read on Shmini Atzeret on the 8th day. And so that's why, all the holidays were missed.
Right, all the holidays were missed. Why
they missed Rosh Hashanah
Sukkot?
and Yom Kippur, and why is it so much Sukkot?
Okay, so it mirrors that Solomon dedicated the temple on Sukkot, and this is a rededication of that temple.
And also the second temple, I think the cornerstone was laid on Sukkot as well. And then the question of why the candles. The real reason is, I think, the consensus assumption that it is absolutely an adaptation of pagan rituals.
An adaptation of pagan rituals.
It's near the solstice, and people would light ascending lights. It's at the solstice. It's people do that in a sense of control of nature. There's a technical term for it called sympathetic magic, where you do things to try to replicate and or affect the natural world. It's not unlike when we shake a lulav. It's the same thing. So it's really a Volksreligion, a people's religion that ascended, and that's why. And then one last thing. Why do we ascend instead of descend the amount of miracles? Everyone says, well, the light should increase, and that's what the school of Hillel says, and that won the day, whereas Shammai said, they should go down, because if there was a certain stock of oil and it dissipated over time. But really, in a way, legally, Shammai's article is, many would consider superior, because if you look at the sacrifices for Sukkot in Torah, they are also descending. So really, the lights, one would think they would go down 8765432 if they replicated how the sacrifices were done.
And yet,
But the reason is that the folks' religion, that the popular culture of doing ascending lights around the solstice won the day, and that's why
That's
that
why it
became,
ascends.
That's why that
Okay.
became the ruling of Beis Hillel.
thank you. That is really helpful. Look, I don't want to shock anybody that we have a lot of pagan rituals that we incorporated into our tradition. Let's say Seder. There are many things, right? And so if the rabbis are seeing that this is what people are doing, that this is how people are celebrating Hanukkah, they are going to find a way to sanctify it. And that, well, this was always ours. Rabbi Frankel used to like to say when anything new was introduced to Judaism, the first reaction was, it's forbidden. The second reaction was, we can accommodate it. And the third reaction was, we invented it. So we don't, but this is actually a nice way to tie up that coat of many colors comes from the King James Bible. Like the way that these things permeate into Jewish culture, the way we then take them and use them and to turn them into ours is a very ancient thing that even, leads up till today. So, all right, we're going to read Torah. I'm going to go get the books.